Hey everyone, we're going to do a very quick special presentation before we get started with our official program today. And I am so thrilled to introduce Assemblyman Heath Flora. Assemblyman Flora represents the 12th Assembly District in the California Legislature, which includes the communities of Turlock, Manteca, and other parts of the San Joaquin Valley. He has represented the district since 2016. He is a lifelong farmer, owns Golden Valley Equipment, which sells agricultural equipment, and has served as a volunteer fighter for over 15 years now as a battalion chief. Most significantly for our purposes today, he is a longstanding advocate of Assyrian genocide recognition and is the author of H.R. 62, which in 2019 recognized the Assyrian genocide within the state of California, making California just the second state in the country to officially recognize the genocide. Assemblyman, thank you so much for joining us today. He is going to present Dr. Ruth Camber with a copy of the resolution.
Well, good afternoon and happy 4th of July weekend. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. One of the things that I learned the most, I've been in elected office for 6 years now. If you would have told me a decade ago that this is what I've been doing, I said, you're out of your mind. It was not what I thought I was going to do. But learning about the Assyrian genocide has been so incredibly important to me. And we learned about it in our first year. And actually, a former patriarch gave my grandfather a Bible, an Assyrian Bible back probably in the 70s. And I still have it in my office today in Sacramento. And so it is very interesting to me how my family has been integrated with the Assyrian community for many, many years without me even knowing it. And so when we started learning about the genocide, it's fascinating to me that we are the only second state in the country that recognizes this. And it was even more fascinating to me how hard it was to get it done. It was just a real pain. But I am so thankful that the state recognizes this now, recognizes all of your family members' sacrifice. I mean, those were a long 4 years for a lot of folks. So it is our privilege, it's our honor to be able to present this resolution to Doctor. And it is an absolute privilege to represent all of you in this community. And so we're thankful, and God bless each and every one of you as we go through this 4th of July weekend. So thank you so much. Appreciate you guys.
Thank you. I know she's going around. Want to stand? How's this?
Is this okay?
Yeah. Thank you.
Straighten it?
Yeah?
We were told to straighten it.
Yeah, figures.
Alrighty, our first speaker today is Dr. Camber, who has been an indelible part of making this exhibition happen. She is a public school English teacher and adjunct professor at the State University of New York, Westchester Community College. Dr. Camber earned her doctorate from New York University in 2013. She has created a verbal testament to Assyrian Americans called A Family Archive, Construction of Identity in the Assyrian American Diaspora. She played an instrumental role in curating photography and narrative for the art exhibition, Assyrians in Yonkers, at the Blue Door Gallery. In 2019, she released Assyrians of Yonkers, a title among the Arcadia Images of America series. This book shares the history of the Yonkers community of Assyrians and how generations of them have come together from different nations and settled in Yonkers to live and contribute to the American mosaic. Many of the Yonkers Assyrians have fled different periods of genocide. Dr. Camber, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. Good afternoon, everyone, actually. As an English teacher, I look to poetry and I look to stories, and they have great meaning in my life. So I wanted to start with this because I wanted you to see part of my journey, because I want to talk about inheriting legacy and creating legacy. What I could hope to do with my reels upon reels of tape, embalm your memories, compose the mummy of your living breath. And if I cut and pasted the transcript and picked out the vital parts and got rid of the waste, and I stitched all the well-formed pieces together and constructed a text, what then? What did I think I could do? Preserve the actual poetry, the living speech of person to person? Armed with a Panasonic, did I think I could undo your death? So initially, I started recording my grandfather because when he turned 90 years old, and he was from Urmi, he came in 1914, I was afraid of losing my Assyrian background, the language, the culture. He was the last of our group, and his family. I was really worried about that, and I had a very strong sense of it. So I started to record him. I did not know that I would end up following these recordings. More would come, or that I would look to others for their stories. That was not my initial intent. Honestly, my initial intent was to embalm and to capture the voice of my grandfather on paper, to create a verbal monument, a testament to his life. In doing that, I needed to read this, and of course, you know, I'm an English teacher, so here we are with Knots on a Counting Rope. I'll just read an excerpt. Tell me this story again, grandfather. Tell me who I am. I have told you many times, boy. You know the story by heart. Then listen carefully. This may be the last telling. And so when I see that, I think about my grandfather who inspired this work. And since then, other relatives, other people in the Assyrian community from all over the world. And at the time I began this work, I never imagined where it would take me. So I inherited a legacy from my grandfather, an intertextual legacy. He would sit me down and say, this is who we are, this is what we are, do not forget it. Let me show you these books. He felt the need to prove that these stories actually happened. He would constantly say, I'm telling the truth. Please listen. This is true. Listen carefully because you will hear what really happened. And so he would pull from books to prove what he was discussing. And I'd like to come over here and show you a little bit. Okay. Can you hear me? Hello? Yes, you hear me? Okay. So over here, if you look, I have a book of verse from Urmia Press. It's from the 1800s, and it was passed on to me. I also have, here we go, a New Testament. I have my great-grandmother's Bible. Pages are folded over in this Bible that I know from my great-uncle's memoirs that the passages she folded were about motherhood, which was very important to her, and so she folded particular biblical passages that mark that. I also have books that were published in the United States. And this is Pilgrim's Progress. If you know any of the history, the Presbyterians gave us their literature as well, but in our language. And I have another book like this. So I was given these books, but I was also given scraps of paper and this little journal, you see? A little leather journal. There are tabulations, financial tabulations in it, but there are also, it's hard to see, but there are some rare gems my great-grandfather happens to mention when his parents were killed by Kurds who broke in through the roof in the house, and how he was stored in a hole in the ground, and that's why his life was saved. So given all of this, I also received this document. So this is my great-grandfather as an older man in the U.S. This is his clothing. the traditional clothing. He did not dress this way, even in Urmi, but only to preach. So when he was trying to convert Kurds, he wanted to show what our customs were and to blend in the culture rather than walk in a suit. So he wore his traditional clothing and he preached. I was also given stories that he translated. I was given brochures that were created for his mission. This document is from 1897. This is a photocopy because the paper is very delicate. I didn't want to travel with it. And as I was on this journey, I also started to collect my own information. Please understand this started with my family and this project grew. So in doing this, I went to hand in the night before my book was due with the publisher at Arcadia. Believe it or not, I Googled Reverend David Jacob Benjamin. Now, my grandfather revered his father. I mean, the reverence was incredible. He used to tell us that he would shake your hand and squeeze it so blood would come out. That's how strong he was. And he was so tall, and he was so beautiful that when he went into Urmi City, he had to cover his face because the woman went crazy for him, okay? So we heard these kind of stories. And as I searched, and can you imagine a college professor putting into Google the name just before I hand in the book, because I had this last shred of hope at 11:30 in the evening at night. And I found his biography in Dutch. And years ago, that wouldn't have been unavailable because we didn't have Google Translate. But it came up, would you like to translate? Oh, yes, please. And I sat up all night reading it. And I found these documents from the Dutch Reformed Church. And I wanted you to hear a letter he actually wrote in 1908. I hope that this letter, dear brother, will find you well off. Dear brother, when I send this letter to you, my heart is filled with sorrow and my eyes with tears for the eternal interests of my people and their relations that were murdered last week and plundered by Kurds and Turks, including a daughter of my sister and some other relations from whom we have heard nothing. These cruel Kurds and Turks unexpectedly fell on 5 cities where many Christians lived. About 200 men, women, and small children have been killed, and their property has been robbed. 2,000 people are now under Russian protection in the city of Urmia. The consul provides half a pound of dry bread per head and per day. While bread is constantly rising in price, so that it has already risen to more than double. And everything is the same with bread. You will understand that many of them will die of want if the Lord does not open a way for them and for all of us. My sister is in my house with her 4 children. I have nothing to support them. I am in very difficult circumstances. I have no rest day or night. The Turks have occupied all of Kurdistan and are fully focused on God. Everyone in Persia is in danger. Remember our prayers so that you can help us. We are in need because so many poor people go to Urmia. At this time, our eye is only on my kind regards to all friends. So Reverend Kirsten received this letter at the Dutch Reformed Church and actually was able to raise some funds that went back. My great-grandfather did have to leave Urmia and he went up to Russia because he was in danger. And the role, he was with the Presbytery, those of you who have heard me speak before, and he left and went with the Dutch Reformed Church. These are all stories that I learned. And because I began to share these stories, people came to me and said, would you please record me? Please share my story or memorialize my story. People don't know, they need to hear from us in our words what has happened. They also need to hear about our resilience, though, not just about what happened with the genocide as it went forward and continues, but how I came to the United States and settled. We have a Bible dated 1901, and a person that I interviewed wrote it, well, the grandchild, wrote in it, I am an American, on day one as soon as he entered Ellis Island. So incredibly excited to be here and to have the hope and the opportunity to flourish. As I began to record people and their legacies, I realized there was much more to this work than the work of family story, but of actual stories that can be shared and written from these memoirs, because they're historical documents. And when you even look at scraps of paper for your own families with dates, my grandfather constantly wrote the day, the year each family member was born, the day they died, where they were buried. It was so important not to lose that information. It was on envelopes, any scraps of paper that he could find. And he told this story to me, which inspired me. And when I found that biography, I realized that there was a man in the Netherlands in his 80s doing research on my family for his church. And he had found these documents, he found photos. The Dutch Reformed Church at the time did not understand the need in Urmia. They thought that he was throwing away the money that was being given, even though I have the reports that say when he was arrested, when they arrested him on a charge that his passport had expired. He actually had rheumatism in his late years because he was jailed in what he called solitary confinement, in a hole in the ground in a box for days. And so I carry this legacy, but in looking at these other stories, I hear the resilience. You know, I heard Michael Yoash say in Washington, we still identify as Assyrian because we've survived. We are survivors. And we're not just in survival mode. We are actually in, here we are doing, we are living, we are contributing members to this mosaic in this country and wherever we have ended up. So I have learned from people stories of their families, but also stories of how women have had to weather a bit of criticism through the 1920s, having fathers that were born in Urmia and the restrictions put on them, and how they managed to move forward and what they gave to their progeny. I want to read something about that. So these poems are from Mark Kaminsky, an oral historian. You said 30 years ago, I had my brothers and little kids, and it was family life. It was happy occasions, and not such happy occasions, but it was always a tishmit mensch. Stories of the good times and the bad came back to you, happenings which you had gone over countless times, repeating life in the imagination, and so you glowed more brightly into life. An old woman sits at a table telling stories. Her grandson comes every Friday to listen. With her husband no longer there to take the lead and to understand everything too quickly, she has become a storyteller. And where the storyteller is loyal to the story, there in the end, out of the startled air around us, another voice will begin. You and I, who are faithful to what we have seen and heard, and to what we are, when we have spoken the last word, will hear a music dispelling emptiness. And so we carry on our legacy. We carry, all of us in this room, whether you're Assyrian or not, you carry a legacy. What you choose to do with that legacy is obviously up to you. But it comes from those very clear roots. And not everybody is interested in their roots. I was the one in the family, like this boy, who went to listen to his grandfather every Friday, that thought the stories were important. Not everyone listened. People told him to be quiet. They had heard it already. I know, Pop, you said that already. I recorded him. I recorded him speaking in Assyrian at 100. I thought it was important. And I get to share that and use it as the base for my own inquiry into other stories. I share these stories even with my students and with you. Some of them are in the exhibit. I have posted several interviews. There is a monitor in our gallery with different stories. And you will also hear my grandfather at 100. He was about to be 101, saying the Lord's Prayer at the dinner table for Thanksgiving. These are the important textures to our lives. They weave who we are, and we continue to weave. And we share that hope that we continue. And that's what I would like to say today. I thank you all. I would like to introduce Dr. Ariane Ashaya. Turn it off. Dr. Ariane Ashaya was born in Urmia, in a town of northwestern Iran with a large Assyrian population. As a child, little did she know that she was growing up in the cradle of an ancient Assyrian Christian center, with shrines such as Mar Sargis and Mart Mariam that date back to the 7th or 8th century AD. Ariane has a PhD in cultural anthropology from UCLA. Her research interests are in the history of the Assyrian diaspora in North America. In 2010, she published 2 books, New Lamps of Old, which is the history of the settlement of Assyrians in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, Canada, the very first settlers of the region, and Familiar Faces in Unfamiliar Places, which is the history of the settlement of Assyrians in Turlock, California. In 2015, her biography on William Daniel, titled William Daniel, Portrait of an Assyrian Icon, was published by the AASJ. Her 2022 publications are The History of Assyrians in Hamadan and The Last Days of Atla Kandi. She also prepared a revised version of the Kitini trilogy by William Daniel, which was also published by AASJ. Dr. Ariane has numerous publications in professional journals, encyclopedias, Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, Encyclopedia Iranica, Encyclopedia of Canada's Peoples, and Assyrian periodicals, Journal of the Assyrian American Studies, Assyrian Star, and Nineveh. She has been very active in the Assyrian educational programs sponsored by the various Assyrian organizations in the Bay Area. She was also one of the contributors and editors of Tapestry, a collection of poems in Assyrian and English, and Sympathy and Satire, a collection of plays by well-known Assyrian poet and composer, William Daniel. I welcome Dr. Ariane. A pleasure. So this mic is on as well. I grabbed this before. Here you go.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of Telling Our Stories exhibit for inviting me to be part of this program. Actually, my field of interest coincides with theirs, so I'm very happy to be here today. We are waiting for the slideshow to go on screen. In speaking about the Assyrian genocide, the focus has been mainly on the adult generation. Today, I want to shift the focus to what happened to the children of the Assyrian genocide. As you see from this title, I have changed the focus. Why am I doing this? It's because a nation's survival doesn't depend only on its material resources, such as land or technology. It also depends on its human resources, like the manpower, educators, professionals, intellectuals, spiritual and intellectual leaders. And children are the human resources of the next generation. So we want to know what happened to the children of the Assyrian genocide and how this affected the next generation. I have used quotes from several resources to give you a brief sketch of the horror stories about the children of the Assyrian genocide and the remarkable resilience and comeback we witness in the descendants of those who survived, as Dr. Campbell already mentioned. I want to warn you that what I'm going to be talking about is going to be very depressing to you, but we have no choice. We have to keep track of our history. As you know, 2/3 of the Assyrian population perished during the genocide of World War I. A large number of these were children. This is because children are vulnerable to starvation, to exposure to cold, to diseases. The amount of material that I have gathered exceeds the time limit I have for this presentation. Therefore, I have only chosen a sample. We start with the children who were killed or who died. I have eyewitness accounts with references at the bottom of each quote, and the sections that I'm referring to, notice it starts with Turkey, goes to northern Iraq, and I have also in Iran. So it covers the whole geographical span of where the Assyrians were affected by the genocide. And we read that in Turkey, in Siirt, one day the Muslims began to gather. I will read from here so that you can hear me. One day the Muslims began to gather all children between the ages of 6 and 15 and led them to the police commissioner's office. From there, these poor little children were brought to a mountainous area called Ras al-Hajjar and killed. Their corpses were thrown into a mountain gorge. This report is from Zakhon, northern Iraq. During the forced evacuation of the Assyro-Chaldean Christians, a number of children fell to the ground from fear. They were all trampled over and crushed. Now this report is from Hamada in Iran. Yes. Around 160 children were housed in an abandoned, wet basement. They were all naked and hungry, some old and torn out mattresses were provided for them to sit or lay down on. 2 weeks later, when I revisited the place, it was empty. All those kids had died. Of those who survived, some were sold into slavery and forcefully converted to Islam. There were also lost forever to the Assyrian nation. The Assyrian children were sold for 1 Mecidiye. This is a Turkish currency. 1 Mecidiye each. Some were sold in exchange for clothes, a basket of fruit, or a chicken. The fate of young women and girls was much worse. This is a personal testimony. Young women were raped and little girls were deflowered in a most brutal way. This is not the right one. Yes, that's the right one. Turkey's policy of deportation was different from that of Persia. The regime separated families. Men, women, and children were deported separately. So we have eyewitness account of one of the little girls that was deported with other kids. She says, there were more than 1,000 women, young girls, and children under 6. Only a few were 12 or 13 years old. We had a few possessions with us. All of us were on foot. During the rest stops, they fell upon us, searched out the prettiest young girls and women, and abused them. Many of my relatives were among them, and I too was not spared. Several Kurds who continued to accompany us along the way suddenly assaulted 2 or 3 young girls who were with us and raped them before our eyes. Often, the parents had the hard choice as to which child to save. In most cases, sons were chosen over daughters. And I have an eyewitness account. We fled behind the retreating Russian troops. I was 4 and my sister was 2. My mother took me on her back and my sister in her arms. But after walking a couple of blocks, my mother returned and left my sister with my grandmother because she could not carry us both. My grandma had a house full of furniture, an orchard, and vineyards. She would not part from them. She thought no one would harm an old woman, but she was mistaken. All those who remained behind were killed. Girls were forcefully separated from their mothers and sent to harems. Many attractive girls and young women were forcibly taken into harems. Many others were promised their lives on accepting Islam if they would merely pronounce its formula and abjure Christ. But instead of doing so, with few exceptions, they gave their souls to God and their bodies to the tormentors, defying hell itself by their boundless trust in God and Jesus Christ. From Haft Evan alone, more than 500 women and girls were handed over to the Kurds in Savuj Bulaq. We hear many stories of heroic action from these women and girls. Many of the girls who were being deported, carried away, when they reached a bridge, they threw themselves down into the river from the bridge because they preferred death to servitude. "4,000 Assyrian women from the Hakkari and Urmia region were kept in bondage in the homes of Muslims. I have statistics from 1917 survivors. I'll just bring your attention to the portions that were orphans. From Urmia, the total number of orphans was, let me see if this will work, 1,350. From Mountain Assyrians, orphans were 2,333. From Suldus, orphans were 76. Of Barendus, orphans were 60. When I added all these up, the total number comes to 4,000 orphans. And notice, the Jacobite Assyrians and the Assyrian Chaldeans of Turkey are not in this count. Also, this count is on 1917 and does not include the final exodus and the carnage that occurred in 1918. This is Judith Khanem. She was the wife of Qasha Yaqub David of Seir. She did a heroic act. She was highly respected in the community. She collected money from the townspeople and bought back some of the subdued girls that the Kurds had carried away. During the flight of Assyrians from Urmia in 1918, many children, their parents were killed or died. So what happens is that the relatives came and claimed those orphans and started taking care of them. So that was an act of kindness that was great. The slides are playing tricks on me. While Ottoman Christian families had been separated under the, I can't read this word, Tekur law, families in Persia had been permitted to stay together. Relatives were able to assume responsibility for orphan children. Example, during the uprooting of Assyrians from Urmia, the 4-year-old Nico was left on roadside. His uncle's wife saw the little boy and rescued him. Near East Relief maintained small orphanages at Tabriz, Hamadan, and Kermanshah for those children who were not claimed by their relatives. The orphans were mostly Assyrian and Armenian. For example, in Hamadan in the year 1918, about 230 unattached children were collected, and they were housed in a camp called Barak, where the Indian soldiers had been previously headquartered during World War I. Rabbi Esther, who had been a teacher and principal in the schools in Urmia, was placed in charge of them. And here I have some pictures of orphans for you. These are girls in Hamadan, 1918. And these are boys in Hamadan, 1918. Now, the refugees, as you know, were carried to the Bakuba refugee camp. There was an orphanage for the children ages 5 to 14 who had lost both parents at the Bakuba refugee camp. There were close to 15,000 orphans in the camp. In fact, 1/3 of the total number of refugees were children. Girls and boys were placed in separate camps and were supervised by older women. The children attended classes, and the playground was built for them. This is refugee girls of Syrian highlanders in Kurdistan. This is an orphanage for boys in Tabriz. Because Tabriz was the site of administration for all of Near East relief work in Persia. Susan Shedd, the daughter of Dr. William Shedd, made international news when she led 400 orphans to safety in Tabriz. Ms. Shedd became the orphanage director of all of Persia. After the Bakuba camp was closed down, the children were transferred to an orphanage in Baghdad. And I have an eyewitness account here. Mrs. Arbi Hubyar, I interviewed her here in Turlock in 1980s. She said, I came from the old country in 1926. My father was killed during World War I. My mom died on the road when we were fleeing. I was taken to an orphanage in Baghdad. I was 14 when my mother died. The orphanage was for Assyrians, but there were Armenians there too. There were about 200 girls and boys there. It was under American supervision. The orphans used to go to school. Each girl had a small job to do. Age ranged from 5 up. The supervisor was the daughter of Dr. Shedd. There were 2 Assyrian ladies. One was Rabbi Rosa. She used to teach there. The Assyrians who fled from Urmia into Russia experienced a role reversal between parents and children, because children were sent to beg in the streets. And so they brought clothes and food that was given to them, and they came back and they fed their parents. Yes, this is what I want. John Alkhaz, a very famous Assyrian poet, wrote a poem about these refugees, and he called it The Tragedy of Badri. Badri is a little girl that during the flight she loses her parents. So what she does is that she goes and stands up on a high cliff looking down at the people who are crossing over in the hope of finding her parents. She stands there gazing down until all the refugees pass by and she still has not seen her parents. The little girl is still hoping that maybe they haven't arrived or maybe they passed. It never occurs to her that they're already dead. we would think that the traumatized children that I have just described, when they grew up, they would become pessimistic, defeatist, they would have a defeatist attitude, and lived out their life with a broken spirit. But you know what? This is not what happened to those children. They became indignant about what had happened to their parents and to their community. And as adults, they became all the more determined to gain back their dignity and seek restitution for their people. How do I know that? What evidence do I have? The evidence is right here in this room. You are all second generation of those children who lost their parents, who lived in destitution, and yet you are here today. So what I invite you to do is to go back home and dig out those old albums and pick out the pictures of your parents and grandparents and go talk to them and ask them to tell you their stories. I know that this is difficult for you to do because we are a very proud nation. We don't want to publicize that our background is rooted in parents or grandparents that were orphans, that were destitute. We don't want to publicize the fact that because our grandparents were orphans and they never saw the love of parents, they never learned how to show us love. I know that because they had lost everything, they had high hopes for their children. So maybe they pushed us a little bit too hard. They were too strict on us. But do not let these inhibitions deter you from telling your stories. If it's that embarrassing for you, change the names, but keep the names Assyrian and write down these stories. You know, these stories are stuff from which novels are written, movies are made. So let us keep that history alive so that it will stay and be documented the same way that our forefathers, ancient Assyrians, always documented their histories, even on clay tablets. I will give you two examples of ordinary people who have an extraordinary life story. Okay. The person on the very left, on the left of you, is Jesse Elias. I interviewed him back in 1980s here in Turlock, and he told me about his family history with tears in his eyes. He was only a teenager when his parents were butchered, and that's the word he used. He said they were butchered. And his sister was rescued by Judat Khanum, that I just showed you her picture. Yet he was a staunch Assyrian nationalist, and in the leadership of both the church in Chicago and right here in the Assyrian Civic Club in Turlock. He raised sons and daughters who were all educated with a university degree. One of them was Dr. Joe Elias. He's on the very right side of you at the back. He was a very well-known physician and one of the founders and longtime board members of the Assyrian American Foundation, Berkeley, California. His granddaughter, now we are moving into third generation, is Annie Elias, who's working with Dr. Camber on the Telling Our Stories project. By the way, both Annie and Dr. Ruth Camber are descendants of orphaned children of the Assyrian genocide and a live example of Assyrian resistance against all odds. The second example okay, we need to go forward. I have to go to the very end. Yes, that's the one. These children in tattered clothes are the children of Assyrian parents who grew up as orphans. Their parents were raising a family in poverty. Actually, these kids are wearing their very best clothes because they know they're going to pose for a picture. Their parents could have taken the boys out of school, put them to become an apprentice with a shoemaker, with a tailor, with a bricklayer, so that they could bring some money home and help their parents survive. But they didn't do that. They preferred to live in deprivation, but put their sons in school. They did not do that with their daughters. They give their daughters off to marriage at the age of 18 and 16. But the boys were all university graduates. The one why is this moving around? I need the very last picture. Yes. Thank you. The one at the very right of you, his name is Johnny Murad Khan. He was a chemistry teacher in Urmia, and he was an Assyrian nationalist icon in Urmia. This one, the second son, Emmanuel Ramston Murad Khan, was a physician. He bought a large tract of land in Tehran, not to build a luxury home for himself, but donated to the Assyrian Association in Tehran and asked them to build a hall and call it William Daniel Cultural Hall. Now this building houses the Assyrian Association. The little one here, Ashur Murad Khan, was the co-founder of Assyrian Universal Alliance and the director and founder of the Atra project in the homeland. As you see, these are the stories of ordinary people with extraordinary history. Please be a part of it. I know that our nation has many shortcomings now. There is no unity. We don't have a home of our own. But remember, we are living in God's time. If God has not abandoned us till now, He's not going to leave us midway. So be encouraged and strive on. Thank you.
At this time, we'd like to ask you if you have any questions for Dr. Ariane.
Or for Dr. Campbell.
Thank you. I think it's right back there. Yeah. Wait a sec.
Did you say, I missed the very beginning when you said you were born, were you first generation, second generation?
I was first generation of orphaned parents.
Okay,
I was born in Urmia.
okay.
After the Bakuba refugee camp, my parents returned back to Urmia and started from scratch there.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know what? Many of you, I need to add that not only there is this horrific experience of World War I and your grandparent generations, but your own parents, they had to languish in Athens and Germany and Austria for years before they could finally settle down and start a life for themselves. So you're a remarkable outcome of heroic parents that brought you now into safety into this country. Be proud of your history.
Does the Assyrian Association in Tehran, do they have a lot of records there? And if so, how far back do they go? And is it still in existence?
What did you say?
She wants to know if the Assyrian Association has records that go back.
Yes, they do.
And how far back?
To the turn of the century. To the turn of the 20th century, not this century.
And do you know if Americans can go to there for educational purposes?
Yes, you can always refer to them. There is a lot, right now there's a lot of online resources that you can find. The history of Urmia has been written in detail, starting back, as I said, at the turn of the 20th century, 19th century, with the activities of the missionaries in Urmia. So there is a lot of documentation that you can find.
May I say something? I also included, as you know, Ashley, there is even a wedding list that we put up in the gallery exhibit that shows all the guests' names and what villages they were from. And I can tell you that ASA has been scanning documents. We just scanned all of the Yonkers ledgers, and we have some of those pages here in the gallery exhibit, but we will continue to do so and hopefully go through it all so it'll be digital for you online.
May I ask you a question now? Are you interested in writing something?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. My great-great-grandmother from the beyond has told me I need to.
Come and see me at the end.
Oh, okay, I will.
Please do.
Thank you so much for your beautiful talk. It was really very interesting. So my grandparents on my mother's side were from Urmia, and they always spoke Assyrian at home, but their last name was Kambarian. So I think that they were partially Armenian. Did the Armenian community with the language, did they use both languages? Do you know?
Urmia, the majority of the population was Assyrian. There were a few Armenians there. And because the state categorized us not as ethnic nationalities, but lumped us all together as Christians, that brought Christians very close to each other for support, you know? So sometimes intermarriage occurred between them. Actually, my own father, on his mother's side, he was partly Armenian, partly Assyrian. So the family name Yan indicates that there is an Armenian somewhere in the genealogy.
There is.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aryan and Dr. Kamber. Great presentation. It did bring tears in my eyes, not just because of hearing all those sad stories, but also to see someone, an American, wants to go back to Iran, do the research, and write the story. All those orphan children, they grew up, they were raised, and they became great Assyrians, great patriots, and they had great Assyrian families that their children also accomplished a lot. How did they become so committed and alert and aware? And how did they grow up to learn their language in a school that their teachers were Americans? How did they grow up to reconnect with their community? I know there was a large number of them together. That must have been a connection, but how else were they connected to their roots to learn about their history, their heritage, their language, their culture, and come back to their Assyrian nation?
At the turn of the 20th century, we had a community in Urmia. They were all literate. They knew both Assyrian and English because they were educated in schools that were run by the American missionaries, and there were also French and other missionaries. So, and they had scholars among them, physicians among them. So they had pride in their community, in who they were. And they had just realized that Christian is just a denominational term, and they were truly national. They were descendants of the Assyrians. And so there was this sense of pride, of identity growing on them just when World War I broke out. So those who became orphans and those who underwent this horrendous experience, they remembered who they were. So they became indignant. And that kind of energized them to regain back their dignity, to show who they are, that they're not just garbage. They're people with education, with parents that were scholars, they were physicians, they were educators, they were teachers, and they said, we are their descendants. So then they wanted to grow up children who were comparable to their own parents that had died during World War I. That's the only way I can understand it and explain it. This is what I saw in my own family. Did I answer you?
I just wanted to say that I think for so many it wasn't about get rich as well. It was really about education, and the value of education was so instilled in their children as well that, you know, the expression, you can't have anyone take that away from you. Once you have an education, you can do. And the respect within our community for educators is also really important. And so many of the women initially, they could either be educators or librarians, but they still went to those schools and they still went to college when they came here, and if they could, and then they went from there, took those degrees, maybe into other fields, but it was so important for them to be able to say, I went to college. I finished high school for some immigrants, depending on the birth order. So I know I can tell you in my family, the youngest came here as an immigrant child in 8th grade. He struggled. He struggled with prejudice in the schools, etc. He did not have, his brother went to Purdue. He was the valedictorian. So, you know, and he was ashamed of that. He was so ashamed that he couldn't be like the rest of his family because of the time and when they came and the circumstances they initially had. But that value for education, this was the man that passed on these stories, who read anything he could find. You would never know that he didn't have that formal education. Never.
For the benefit of the Armenian ending yan, there's a very little known, something that some people may not know. Can you hear me? Am I being heard?
Can you tell me what she said? Could you please repeat it? None of us
Can't hear you.
Okay. Okay. Somebody asked about Armenians in Iran. After World War I, Assyrians who left Urmia were not accepted, were not allowed to go back. I don't know if you know this.
Yes,
You know that.
yes.
And many Assyrians who wanted to come back added a yan to their name. I mean, for instance, Paulus became Paulician. Robert Paulician, you know? Robert Paulician, Dr. Paulician.
Yes.
He was Paulus. His parents added a yan, the whole family became Paulician. And there were some others also. By adding a yan, became Armenians, and they could go back. So I thought,
That's a fantastic point. That's a very true point. They kind of changed their names so that they would be admitted back.
admitted back. Yeah.
Yes. Who is she? Do you know her name?
Sorry, if I may add one more point to this Yan story, because I'm also a Yan. There was a time where they were basically giving certificates to Assyrians. And at that time, mostly Assyrians, there was a big, I could say, ignorance on part of Muslim-dominant community in Iran that considered all the Christians in Iran as Armenians. So they would say, like in case of my great-grandfather, when he went and they asked your family name, because it was from Joseph family, he said Yosef, and they said, oh, Yosef is a name. Armene diler means they are Armenian, right, Yusefian. So they considered every Christian to be Armenian. It's also part ignorance from the authorities' side. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Julius Mirza, and in Assyrian is Julius. I want you to know that my parents also grew up in Urmi and were educated by American Presbyterian missionaries. And so my parents recognized the value of an education and realized and knew that the local schools were not going to be a good byproduct of knowledge. So my father looked for us, try to find a school outside the country. So we went to India, to a British boarding school. And based on the certificate that I got at that school, I was accepted by Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo in 1954. So to answer your question, the love that the parents had for their children to make sure that they would be someday there would be something in this world was one of the primary factors for what you see and hear this afternoon. Thank you.
Excellent. Do you notice you're already telling your stories? You're telling your stories already in this room. You just have to either record it or write it down.
I loved your presentation. My question is, where can I find your books, both of you, Dr. Kamor and Dr. Ariana? Is it on, I'm interested in your books, and where can I find them? Are they on Amazon? Do you have a website? Where can I locate your books and your articles?
Both of us. Some of them are on Amazon. You can get them through Amazon. The one book I did is one of those pictorial histories with Arcadia Publishing, but it's also on Amazon. And I know I purchased Dr. Ariane's book about Turlock on Amazon.
She's my cousin, so I have a present for you.
I have a comment on one of the pictures you showed. My great-grandmother was in that picture. She was Robbie Ister, who ran the school in Hamadan for the orphan children. I never met her, of course. Her daughter, Katie, was my grandmother, who moved there temporarily to help her grandmother and caught typhus in the mission and died. So she was 27 years old and had 3 children left in Tabriz. So that's our story.
My grandfather was a bootlegger. That's my story.
Sometimes you have to.
Hi, Dr. Ariane. My name is Albert Gabriel. I'm the editor of Nineveh.com. The gentleman talked about the missionary in Urmia. I got a picture of it. Can you tell me about Reverend Jacob in Urmia?
Yes.
I have another letter from him here.
This is a picture from Urmia College, and these are the students and teachers.
Yeah, my aunt's name in the back of the picture, and they are, you know.
Look at, I don't know if you can see it, it's such a substantial building, that Urmia College in Seir, village of Seir. It was called Qalla.
What year is that?
I think
That picture must date to 1910. 1900?
No, 1919, I believe.
You have another picture there.
Yeah, that's my grandfather, Rabbi Juri al-Basmachi. He was the publisher of Bibles in Urmia. This is the original letter from Dr. Reverend Jacob about the genocide.
Reverend Jacob brought one of my uncles here from Seir.
Thank you for keeping them.
I'll tell you the story about those documents later on. But I need to know, if you don't mind, the history of Reverend Jacob. What church was he with, and what was his connection with the missionary?
Yes.
And was that missionary a Presbyterian missionary or Catholic missionary? What was it?
Yeah, the biggest was a Presbyterian missionary. They had the largest establishment in Urmia. After they came the French Lazarists. They had an orphanage even there. My own sister, she studied with the Catholic nuns at the French mission. Thank you. Maybe you can get copies of those.
Oh, yeah. We'll scan.
What is the status of the records that were in the mission at Army? Did they get destroyed in the period? Okay, so those are just gone.
Most of them are gone, yes. Only some religious books are left because they were hidden in the churches.
She's been reading missionary accounts from
I have the diary of a missionary who wrote day by day what happened. That's why I wanted to see you. I want you to know about that.
We are going to show the film Assyria AD. Right now it's a short film about the history of Assyrians into modern day.
Thank you again so much to Dr. Ashai and Dr. Camber for their incredible, very moving presentations. Like Dr. Camber mentioned, we're showing Assyria AD, which is produced by the Assyrian Social and Cultural Youth Organization of Australia and has been so kind to lend us the rights to show it, and directed by Remy Jaju.
Okay, we would like to encourage you, please, to go ahead to the gallery. It's connected to this building, and see what we have on display. And also, right outside in the lobby, we encourage you, please, to fill out the surveys, and we will collect the surveys. So if you could please complete them, we'd really appreciate it for the university. And I would like to thank Erin Hughes for everything she's done. She's been our point person on this end of the university. I thank you very much, Erin. And everybody, have a great afternoon.